Hello everyone and welcome to this month's ITA Clean Sport Education webinar. It's great to have so many of you joining us from all around the world. My name is Armand Urban, member of the education team at the International Testing Agency. Today's session is part of our expert series and we will be focusing on a key topic, nutrition. Before we dive in, I want to make sure that everyone is aware of the simultaneous translation options we have for you. So on your Zoom menu, you should see a button called Interpretation. We deliver this session in English, but we're also offering simultaneous translation options in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. And please note that all languages are being recorded and will be available in our YouTube channel. You can also use automated translated captions. Simply select a supported language from the captions box. Please note that these captions are translations of the original English audio. In the case of any discrepancies, the meaning and spirit of the English version will prevail. This month, I'm delighted to welcome back a familiar face. I would like to hand things over for a few opening words to Professor Louise Burke, Director of the IOC Diploma in Sports Nutrition and Professor of Sports Nutrition at Australian Catholic University. Hi Louise, we're very pleased to have you with us today. Truly appreciate you taking the time to join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm just trying to get my video to work. And I'm so excited to be here. It's midnight for me, but I'm glad I stayed up because I'm seeing so many people from different countries and different sports, and I'm just excited that so many people have taken time out of their day to be here.
Thanks, Louise. And well, before I hand things over to you, I would also like to take a moment to set the stage for the next part of our session. I will briefly introduce the topic, touch a little on supplements, and then explain how we're going to approach the questions that all the attendees submitted. Now, of course, we won't be able to go through every single question individually, but we have carefully reviewed all your submissions, and we have created a structure that allows us to address as many key topics as possible. Our goal is to give you an overview of the most important points that you have raised, but also, of course, leaving some time at the very end for your live questions. So if something comes up to mind as the session goes on, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to get as many as we can. All right, well, with that said, let's dive in. And once again, thank you for joining us today. So let's do a bit of an introduction into today's topic. So we're tackling nutrition today. And as we know, well, many different factors contribute to success in sport, and nutrition is a key component. But what is the link to clean sport? Well, according to the IOC consensus statement on dietary supplements and the high-performance athlete, nutrition usually makes a small but potentially valuable contribution to successful performance in elite athletes. And within that nutrition strategy, dietary supplements can make a minor contribution. The statement also highlights, that supplement use in sports is not just at the elite level. It's across all levels of sport. Now, while some supplements, when used in the right way, can provide a benefit to an athlete, others can harm an athlete's health, performance, and even their livelihood and reputation, especially if their use result in an anti-doping rule violation. So, why are supplements a risk for athletes? Well, supplements are a risk because the supplement industry is not well regulated. And due to the lack of regulation in the industry, supplements are a risk as they can contain prohibited substances as their main ingredients. They can also be contaminated during the manufacturing process or in the supply chain of ingredients. Supplements can also be mislabeled, meaning that what's on the label doesn't actually match what is inside. And both contamination and mislabeling can lead to the inadvertent ingestion of prohibited substances, even if the athlete had no intention to cheat. Now, there is more. Some supplements have been found to contain harmful substances like heavy metals and pesticides, which can be a risk not just to an athlete's career, but also to the long-term health. So, the key message here is this: no supplement is ever 100% risk-free. That's why it's so essential that athletes only use supplements when there is a clear, expert-informed reason to do so. Now, as we mentioned, this session is focused on nutrition, and naturally there will also be some times when we mention supplements when we address some questions from the Q&A box. If athletes do choose to use a supplement after considering all the options and making an informed decision, then they should only consider the use of a batch-tested supplement. Batch testing in the context of anti-doping means that a supplement that has been tested by an independent supplement certification company for substances prohibited in sport. And here on your screen, you can see some independent certification companies that we recommend. Given we know the risk of supplements for athletes and the impact even an unintentional anti-doping violation can have on an athlete, we recommend that athletes do everything they can before using supplements to mitigate that risk. So to talk more about this big piece at the bottom of the pyramid, we have invited Louise to this webinar to share her practical advice and tips on how to make most out of nutrition. Louise is a sports dietitian with 40 years of experience. She worked at the Australian Institute of Sport for many years and was the team dietitian for Australia at 5 Olympic Games. She's the director of the IOC Diploma in Sports Nutrition and Professor of Sports Nutrition at the Australian Catholic University. Again, thanks so much, Louise, for joining us today. So the first question is, what's your top nutrition tip for the week leading into a competition?
That's a great question, and I've got two different strategies. The first strategy is to understand what you need for your competition, because sometimes when people get to the pointy end of their sport, they start doing things that they've heard other people do, or they've thought that this is part of sport rather than things that they've tried themselves. So make sure that you're doing something that's familiar, but also make sure that you're not being distracted. So sometimes competition's away from home, or sometimes in competition week, you're not doing the normal training that you're doing. And so life can be suddenly different. And you can be without your favorite foods, or you can start to eat like a tourist rather than an athlete. So by understanding what you need and by planning ahead to do just what you need and leave the celebrations or the tourist things till after your competition, then you can concentrate on what's important for you.
Thanks, Louise. That's super helpful. It's clear that understanding your actual field needs can really make a difference. What if let's keep building on that, because it leads nicely into the next question. And actually, the next question is, what are the most common mistakes athletes make with their nutrition?
Well, athletes want to be good at what they're doing, and sometimes they try to be perfect, and they think that foods come in two different types, good and bad. And that if they're wanting to do the right thing, they have to give up all the bad foods and only eat the good foods. And that can often mean that they're limiting themselves from eating some, important foods in their diet, because they've got unusual ideas about what the good things are. And not only is food there to be providing nutrients, it's also part of our day-to-day enjoyment, and it's part of social interaction. So if you're eating a very restricted diet where you're just doing clean eating or only eating the things that you think are important, you can miss out on some of the important nutrients found in the foods that you're missing out on. But also you can start adding to the stress in your life because you're starting to be over-concerned. So we like to try and make people feel comfortable and confident with what they're eating, and look for the range in their diets, especially with things that they can share with other people, and to gravitate to the most wholesome foods and the nutrient-rich foods, but not to be so strict that you start making life miserable.
What if you continue building on that line of thought, because the next question is actually links nicely. So how can athletes critically evaluate nutrition advice they see, especially these days on social media? And what red flags should they look out for?
Yes, well, there's a lot of influencers on social media that tackle nutrition. And for me, I can usually tell when someone's not the kind of person I want to get advice from if they start trying to promise me magic, when they've got these magic ingredients, particularly things they want you to buy from them, whether it's a diet or whether it's a supplement. That starts being a bit of a trick for me. And if they start using buzzwords, one of the key words that I don't like hearing is that some foods are toxic, or that this particular diet plan is going to be a detox diet. Now, those kinds of concepts are completely wrong. There's no food that is toxic, and our bodies have different mechanisms for being able to handle things in food that aren't ideal. So trying to be scared into doing something isn't the best way to receive advice. When I hear that some people are saying, give up this, give up that, and this food is terrible for you, then I get worried. And I'm particularly worried when people have got these wonderful stories about how they've cured their own diseases, or they've lost a lot of weight and they haven't got any nutrition qualifications. They've just got a story about a miracle. That makes me very fearful that the advice that they're giving is not really sound.
Thanks, Louise. That's such an important reminder, especially with how much content is actually out there on social media. What if we now shift the focus a little, because probably not every athlete has the same level of access to expert advice, or I would say tailored guidance. So for those with fewer resources, what should they prioritize to get the most out of their nutrition?
Well, most of us live in a food system where there are local foods and foods that are nutrient rich and found in season or found close to us. And if we use those foods as our base and find ways to buy in bulk and cook in bulk and to plan ahead, rather than be buying packaged food all the time, or buying things that come from a long way away and are exotic but are much more expensive, then we can focus our resources and make our dollars go further. And there's lots of things that are practical and useful about packaged foods, that they can come with us on a busy day, but you can do your own version of them by cooking ahead and being able to put your own little portions in containers that can go with you, or have ways in which you can take a big recipe that you've made and divide it up into a number of different meals. You can be clever with the way that you spread your food over the day and make it travel to where you need to go without having to pay for somebody else to package that food for you. And there's often ways that you can make your own sports products. There's lots of benefits and practicality in having things like protein shakes or other forms of special sports foods. But as we've talked about before, there's a risk involved. But they're often much more expensive than using something that's similar from everyday foods. And so if you're wanting to have a protein powder, you could use just skim milk powder to add to your milkshake, to add a little bit more oomph to it. And you can make your own sports drink by using a juice and just adding a little bit of salt to it. So there's ways that you can make a homemade version of things to replace some of the things that other people are paying more dollars for. If you're clever, you can plan that all ahead and get the best out of what's around you.
Great tips, Louise. Thank you. And really useful reminders for all the athletes joining us today. Let's keep going with another essential part of, I would say, daily life for athletes, and that's hydration. Can you explain us why it's so important, and how athletes can make sure that they're getting enough fluids, and how an athlete can ensure they're drinking enough?
Yes, so our bodies are about 60% or maybe up to 70% water, depending on our size. And every day we lose some fluid, we sweat, we lose it in urine, and we need to replace that to keep our body levels topped up. And once we lose more than about 2% of our body mass, so if I'm 50 kilos, that's a kilo or a litre of liquid for me, then our body systems start being a little bit less productive and less functioning, especially in hot weather. And so if you're sweating during exercise and not replacing it in hot weather because you've not understood how much you're sweating, we can get into a situation where our levels go down and it can make exercise feel harder. It can interfere with our ability to regulate our temperature, and it just interferes with optimal performance. We're all different with when that starts being noticeable, but often when there's a sudden change in the amount of sweating we're doing because there's a change in the weather, or maybe you're suddenly doing a change in the amount of exercise that you're doing, sometimes we don't think about how much that's meaning in terms of fluid losses, and we don't naturally just top up until a couple of days later when we've gotten into the routine. So we try and give athletes some tips about understanding how to know when they've become dehydrated. And the quickest way to know that in general from day to day is if there's a sudden change in your body weight. If you wake up today and you weigh yourself first thing in the morning and you're 2 kilos lighter than yesterday, you haven't changed your body fat levels. What you've done is just lose fluid that you haven't topped up yet. And you can also tell by when you get up in the morning and have your first wee sample, if it's just a small amount and it's very dark, that's also another clue that you've been dehydrated from the day before. And so that can give you some reminders to do more to drink over the day so that you're topping up what you're sweating. And same things if you're looking just at a session of exercise. If you weigh yourself before you run and then when you get back in after you run, and towel yourself down so that you're not weighing the sweat that's in your clothes, you can then get a feel for how much you've lost over that session, because those acute weight changes are simply measuring weight loss from fluid. And so again, if you're a kilo lighter at the end of the session, that means that's a litre of fluid that you've sweated that you didn't replace. And that may give you a clue as to, I need to do more drinking during that session. You don't have to drink everything that you sweat during the session. That's sort of an old wives' tale. But you don't want to go out in hot weather and come home and be, as I said, more than about 2% less in terms of fluid than you started off. If there's a way that you can take some fluid with you and drink more frequently to keep that net loss over the session to less than about 2% of your body weight, then that's probably the best way of coping with hydration. Sometimes that's impossible. I've been watching the Australian Open tennis and it's been very hot. And even though the tennis players get a change of ends between every 2 games, they're still sweating a lot, and they may be more than 2% dehydrated by the end of the session. So sometimes you have to do the best that you can and then make up for it when you finish by rehydrating. But generally during the session, if you can look at available ways to drink and have food, the fluids there with you and get used to being able to tolerate it, that's the best way to address your hydration needs.
Thanks, Louise. Now, let's shift gears slightly and touch on something that's particularly relevant for athletes and coaches in weight category sports. What evidence-based nutrition strategies would you recommend for coaches and federations to promote within these settings?
And look, this is a very prominent area where nutrition is sometimes mismanaged. And some of it is a cultural thing that in many weight-based sports, the idea that you weigh into the division that you're going to compete in leads to people trying to be lighter to get into a division where they think they're going to be competing against smaller athletes and give them an advantage. And so there's been a culture where in many of these sports, athletes can lose very large amounts of weight in the days leading up to an event, usually sweating it off, and go into that event. Or sometimes if the weigh-in's very close to the start of the competition, there's not enough time to rehydrate and to recover. Sometimes the weigh-in may be the day before the event, and so there is the opportunity to recover, but it's still not a healthy thing to be crash dieting and dehydrating yourself very dramatically just to make the competition. So we try and work with sports these days to say, let's be sensible about choosing a weight category so that your normal training and nutrition strategies will keep you close to that weight division. You might be 1 or 2% of your body weight above that weigh-in target, and that you have healthy nutrition patterns during the training phases so that you can train well and be close to that target. And then in the days, the weeks leading up to the actual competition, there's ways in which you can do a small amount of dehydration. And another thing we can help athletes do is to take the fibre out of their diet for a couple of days before the competition weigh-in, so that instead of having a stomach full of undigested food, you can still get nutritional support, but have less fibre in your stomach so that you just weigh a little bit less on the day that you're weighing in. And that does the trick of just teasing off a small amount of weight to let you reach your target, but without compromising your ability to fuel up for the event that you're doing. So we like to work with the coaches and say that it's important to have sports science support, particularly nutrition support, in these sports, so that you can teach athletes safe and healthy ways of managing the weight, rather than getting into these bad habits very early on and then just making it a sort of a miserable sport where you're always worrying about when the next competition is and whether you're going to be able to even compete because you've not made the weigh-in target.
Thanks for that, Louise. On the topic of body composition and performance, let's build on that line with a related question. So for athletes aiming to reduce their body fat without compromising performance, what nutritional strategies are the most effective?
Well, you have to create an energy deficit to lose body fat. That means that you have to be exercising or burning more calories in a day than you're consuming. But you want to make that deficit a sort of a small amount so that you're achieving the weight loss, but not putting your body under stress of not getting enough support for the work that you are doing, and not missing out on the nutritional needs that you have to keep yourself healthy. And sometimes people get into the habit of doing these crash diets where they really severely restrict their energy intake, or they do crazy amounts of exercise, that sort of biggest loser type idea. And what that does is put a lot of stress on your body. It's psychologically stressful, but it's also physically stressful to leave your body in that sort of energy deficit. So we try and work with athletes about setting sensible targets for where they need to be with their body composition, and then periodizing over the year some phases where they will be in a gentle energy deficit to get there. And sometimes it might be in several sections that you might do a little bit of body composition manipulation over this bit of training, and then you do some training where you're mostly concentrating on performance, and then you might do a final little bit of manipulation to get closer to race weight. So working with the sport to find the times of the year when it's suitable for doing a little bit of body composition manipulation, and then doing it in a way that's both physically and psychologically not stressful, or least stressful, is the best way of managing it. And certainly trying to work with athletes that when they have an off season, that they still eat sensibly then, so that they're not gaining huge amounts of weight, which then they have to get off when they start back into the next season.
Thank you, Liz. And while we're talking about different nutrition strategies and needs, what if we shift now to a little and focus on athletes following a specific dietary approach? So our next question is, do you have any nutrition tips for vegan athletes? And are there any particular consideration when it comes to using plant-based proteins instead of animal sources?
Yes, so it's really interesting to find out why people are motivated to have a vegan lifestyle, because people can vary from that being their religious or cultural pattern of eating, to other people are motivated by animal cruelty or just planetary sustainability. Some people do it just because they've heard it's a healthy thing to do, or it's what all this, the cool people are doing. And if you can understand somebody's motives, you can help work with the best way of achieving their goals. Above all, we still need to promote food variety. And sometimes when you're working with a diet which focuses on giving up things, giving up all animal foods, people just focus on what they're giving up instead of thinking, all right, so I'm now not eating the sources of protein and calcium and iron that were in the animal foods. So what are some vegetarian, vegan patterns of eating that will replace those? And so if you're going to do a vegan lifestyle, then you need to explore being able to cook lots of things like nuts and seeds and legumes and soy products and other nutrient-dense forms of the plant-based nutrients, and include those in your diet. So it's not just what you're giving up, it's thinking about what you're going to replace it with. And the food industry now recognises that many people have become vegan eaters that weren't previously, and so they're now marketing a lot of foods for this population. And some of the foods that they provide are helpful, and they provide alternatives to meat and dairy, etc. But it's also become quite popular these days just to make lots of what I call treat foods, but promote them as being vegan. So there's lots of ice cream and chocolate and cakes, and sometimes people think, oh, it says vegan, so it must be healthy and I can eat lots of them. And rather than just concentrating on the processed foods, particularly the ultra-processed foods, and thinking, oh, that must be great because it's vegan, we need to still focus on the nutrient-dense forms of food and balance the treats that we have. Sometimes for athletes, when you're making a big change like that, this is a good time to get advice from an expert, because then they can help you to think through why you're doing it and what the best ways of doing it are, and to find ways in which these new ways of eating can be integrated into your lifestyle and meet your nutritional requirements.
Let's build on that and look at another important situation that actually many athletes face at some point in their careers, and this is injury. Can you share any advice on how nutrition can support an athlete who is going through rehabilitation and recovery from an injury?
Yes, so we've got to know a little bit more about the injury and what that has meant, because sometimes that means surgery, sometimes it means there's a large amount of body tissue that needs to repair, and that creates special nutritional needs. And sometimes athletes don't think about those. There's a big fear that many injured athletes have that, oh, now I'm not doing all the training I used to do and I'm going to gain weight, and I don't want to do that because it's going to be so hard to get back into shape again. And so they restrict their energy intake and their nutrient intake unnecessarily because they're worried about that. And in fact, what they're doing is cutting themselves off from some of the important energy and nutrients like protein that are required for repair. So again, when there's a sudden change or a stress to people, I think that's the best time to invest in getting nutrition advice that says, this is the reality of the injury, this is what I need to do, and this is where the weight maintenance or the energy changes that are happening because I'm not doing the training or the competition that I used to do, this is how I'm going to cope with that. But this is how I'm going to also prioritize the nutrients that I need that will help me to repair and to hang on to muscle mass and other things that can happen involved with the injury repair.
Well, thanks, Louise. That's really insightful, especially for athletes navigating the ups and downs of injury. Before we go on to the next question, a reminder to all of our attendees to please send us your questions using the Q&A box so we can address those live. Let's shift focus slightly. Another topic that also came up in several of your questions that you submitted, and it's related actually to female athletes. So the next question is, are there any specific nutrition recommendations or resources that female athletes should consider during the different phases of their menstrual cycle?
Look, I'm so pleased to see questions about female athletes, because for so long we've neglected that there may be differences between males and females when it comes to nutritional needs. And so that's the good news. But the bad news is that sometimes when we get interested in things, we kind of over-exaggerate the needs, or we try and come up with something that's really special just to make people feel that we've looked at what they need. And this is happening in, I think, the focus on making females eat differently and train differently according to their menstrual cycle phase. Cycle syncing, it's sometimes called. And what you see is that, oh, athletes should only do this kind of exercise when they're having their period, or athletes should only eat this sort of food when they're in the follicular phase or the luteal phase of their menstrual cycle. And we do know that the hormones, that female hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone, change in concentration over the menstrual cycle, and that they do have subtle changes in the way that our bodies react metabolically when we've got different levels of these hormones. But there's no evidence that that then translates to say that everybody should only eat this or not eat that at different phases. The reality is that even though we've got a menstrual cycle, we're all quite different with that. And even the same female may have different cycles from month to month in terms of how long it is, how their hormone levels change. And so this idea that everybody should be doing the same thing, or that you should be doing the same thing every time, it's really more magic than it is based on sound science. And it might make people feel special that they could eat specially this way and train specially that way, but it just complicates life. And it's, we'd like to have people focusing on things that really make a difference rather than just getting into stuff that's just trendy. So what we do know, though, is that females often have their own individual symptomology around their menstrual cycles. Some athletes say that I feel particularly energetic, or I feel tired at this phase, or sometimes I have gastrointestinal discomfort at different phases. And that might be something that's regular with that person. So what we would tend to do is to say, understand yourself and work with what you know works for you, rather than try and do something that everybody else is doing when you're an individual. So we try and encourage females to listen to their bodies and to work out what works for them specifically. And what's really amazing is that when studies are done and, talk to winning athletes, they'll often find that every different phase of the menstrual cycle has been associated with a gold medal. There's not one part of the menstrual cycle that's terrific and the other part isn't. Every female has their own cycle and their own responses to it, and we can learn more about ourselves rather than pretending we're all the same female and all have to do the same thing.
Thanks, Louise. That was actually great, especially as more awareness grows around the different needs of female athletes. Let's keep the momentum going with a question that a lot of athletes actually submitted to the registration, especially those with heavy training loads or high energy demands. And the question is it possible to meet a high daily calorie needs through food alone without actually turning to supplements?
Yes, you can. Now, the thing that supplements have that's practical and valuable about them is they're often packaged in a way that makes them easy to consume, or they're packaged in a way that can go with you on a busy day. And if you're an athlete that's a high calorie requirer, you need to find ways in which there's every hour of the day an opportunity to be eating. You can't just eat sort of 3 meals a day and not make use of the time in between meals. And often drinking food is easier in terms of not feeling so full or taking time. It's much easier just to sip on something than it is to chew your way through a mountain of food. So there's lots of different everyday drinks and foods that can go with you on your day that don't have to be supplements, that can let you do the same thing. So we talked before about being able to make your own homemade versions of smoothies and milkshakes, etc. And if you're organised, you can take lots of little snacks with you on a day. Again, it's thinking about where you're going to be and what sort of places you can store food or have it prepared, that if you find that you've got a routine, you can take food with you. And little snacks, there's lots of wholesome things, trail mix like dried fruits and nuts and crackers and cheese and all sorts of things that you can take with you. And whether you're eating or drinking it, you're just making use of those little spaces in your day so that you're always topping up your energy needs.
Let's move into our final block of the submitted questions from the audience, which actually touches on some important also very important topics linked to also nutrition. So the question is, how can red S be identified early, and what will be your recommendation for supporting athletes who might be at a risk?
So that stands for relative energy deficiency in sport. And it's a syndrome that we described the symptoms associated with not consuming enough energy for the amount of exercise that you're doing. And it can be associated with deliberate weight loss, that if people are deliberately restricting food or over-exercising for weight management, that can be one source of it. Disordered eating and eating disorders are also a very major risk for this. But sometimes athletes just don't know how much to eat. You know, a lot of young athletes will get identified as being talented, and then they'll be given an opportunity to work in a squad or a training program that makes them train twice as hard as they used to, and they have no feel for what they need to eat to respond to that, and they've got less time in the day to do it. So, or maybe they don't have the money to afford to eat the amount of food that's required. And so consistently under eating can lead to these situations where the body's not getting enough calories to support both being healthy as well as all the exercise. And so what we need to do is to have early markers of that, changes in performance, but for females particularly, losing your menstrual cycle can be a very, very identifiable risk factor for that. Now, there's lots of reasons that people get tired or people can have menstrual disturbances. Some of the other symptoms that are often involved are bone stress fractures, because bone's not getting enough energy to keep itself healthy. And these sorts of injuries, or training hard but not getting the benefits that you expect to see, these are all sort of symptoms that are sometimes involved with RED-S, but not always just involved with RED-S. So at early stages of just not feeling that you're getting the benefits from the exercise that you're doing, or knowing that you're just not eating enough but you don't know how to do it, reasons to see an expert and have a proper diagnosis made and some support to be able to unravel what's going on. And doing it in early stages is really important, because some of the things that happen with RED-S, such as the bone health problems, you know, once you've had some stress fractures, that's really an injury that takes a lot of time to heal from and puts you at risk of getting more. And so it's so much better to avoid getting to that situation than finding yourself there and then having to work your way out of it. So we try and say to athletes, you know, be aware of how important nutrition and the right amount of nutrition is, and don't over-exercise or build up too much training too quickly. There's lots of reasons for that, but one of them is just not getting the energy support right. And at early signs of not adapting and having some of these symptoms, seek attention so that people can get in and give you the help that you need before some of those problems have become very severe.
Thanks, Louise. Let's keep on with the practical question that's actually relevant for many people in our audience. If an athlete or their support person is seeking a nutrition expert in their own country, what kind of credentials should they be looking for?
Well, in most countries, there'll be some sort of a qualification like a dietitian. That would be the expert that has most of the relevant information at their fingertips. And many people who are dietitians also then go on to become sports dietitians by really concentrating their area of interest to working with athletes. There are other people who are nutrition trained. They can be nutritionists, or sometimes medical experts can also focus on their expertise in nutrition. So it's not just dietitians, and it varies a little bit from country to country, but you definitely want somebody who's got university qualifications in nutrition, and preferably somebody who understands sport, because you can know a lot about nutrition, but not understand it from an athlete's perspective. And so it's nice to be able to get people who have the combined talent and knowledge to be able to understand sport and to understand nutrition and counselling athletes on how to get the best out of the eating that they're doing.
Thanks, Liz. And while we're talking about practical support, let's look at nutrition during those high demand periods like training camps or tournaments. Do you have any advice on how athletes can best monitor and manage their nutrition during these intense training or competition periods?
Well, we've talked a lot about being organised and planning ahead. And I know it's really difficult when you've got a lot of training and you've got competition, or you've got a lot of focus that you trying to put onto the training side of things and how performance is going. But being able to also think about planning ahead with nutrition and then having some way of putting it all together and just seeing how you're going. I often get athletes to take photos of what they've eaten in a day for me, because that helps them at the end of the day to remember and to add it all up together. You know, sometimes we get so busy that we think, oh, I had a good lunch, but then they forget that they didn't have anything else for the rest of the day, and now it's getting late at night and they're only having a bowl of cereal before they go to bed instead of a more substantial meal. So sometimes doing something as simple, and most of us are carrying phones around with us for most of the day, so we've got a camera there with us, doing something that allows you to take stock of the big picture can be helpful. And then talking about it with somebody who sort of understands and can put it together. So sometimes, you know, people get interested in nutrition and then get very worried about it, and they're not quite sure whether what they're doing is the right thing, and they can get too worried about it. I've said taking photos can be a good way of keeping on touch with what you're doing, but sometimes people get so focused that it becomes more than stressful just to be thinking about it all the time. And those situations, being able to speak to an expert about it to get some really sound advice and perspective is great. And, you know, one of the things that dietitians are trained in is not just understanding food, but counselling people and giving them some great advice about how to make things practical in their lifestyle. You know, you can get a food plan from anybody, but when you look at the list of foods, you think, I don't like this one, or I can't cook this one, or I'm not home when this one needs to be eaten, so where am I going to get it from? But working with a dietitian is a good way of saying, all right, so we've got some ideas. There's lots of different ways of making those happen. Let's see how we can make it work in your particular lifestyle with the foods that you like to eat and what's available to you.
Thanks, Liz. And to wrap up our submitted questions, let's turn to one that came up quite a bit also in different registrations. Do you have any nutritional advice, especially for parents of young athletes?
Oh, that's a great question. And look, I'd love to think that parents with young athletes will be interested to learn about their children's nutritional needs and to find out what is important for their training, and to be able to think about accommodating the family menus to be able to make that happen for the athlete. And sometimes it's practical things like, what else do we need to add to the meal, or what sort of meals can I make that can be eaten by the rest of the family now, but when the athlete comes home late from training is still available to eat then, or can be eaten in the car on the way home. It's all about changing the practical aspects of eating as a family to accommodate the needs as the young athlete. Certainly learning about making it normal food and everyday food, rather than thinking that, oh, now they're an athlete, they just have to have sports foods and supplements. Learning also things that can go on the day with them. It's often the need to eat more than other children are eating is the key, which means that the child has to become organised and be able to have things that can go on their day with them. And above all, though, I'd say try and make food still a social and family occasion. one of the things that I feel sad about sometimes with young children is that suddenly when they become an athlete, it's, oh, they can't eat this anymore. They have to be only eating as an athlete. And so, children have birthday parties and they have plenty of family occasions where special foods are eaten. And I hate to think that the child athlete is sort of under pressure to not do all the things that makes food enjoyable. And as part of celebrating food as a family, there's ways in which you can integrate needs of the athlete with still enjoying food and being able to eat it as a community and social occasion.
Thank you so much, Louise, for going through all those questions submitted in advance. It's been incredible, insightful. And as we mentioned earlier, we have also received quite a few questions live in the Q&A box. So we will tackle those in just a few seconds. But before we finish up, let me quickly highlight the resources I mentioned at the start. If you're looking for quick, reliable information, there are also some 1-minute expert answers to common questions on nutrition available on the IOC Diploma in Sports Nutrition YouTube channel, and definitely it's worth checking out. Also, many anti-doping organizations have information available on nutrition and supplements. Here on your screen, there are just a few examples. So you, as an athlete support person, you can definitely take a look at those. But we also strongly recommend reaching out to your own national anti-doping organization to see if they have specific resources for your guidance to support you. Now, let's keep going with a few more great questions that the audience just submitted. And again, thank you, Liz, for all the answers that you already shared with us. The first question from Andre, he has a question about amino acids. And the question is, the literature regarding amino acid is quite controversial. Generally speaking, do you think they should be classified in which category according to the Australian Institute of Sport classification? A, B, or C?
Most of the time we can get all the amino acids we need from protein-rich foods. And there's been a lot of interest in individual amino acids to see whether having them by themselves or having them in greater amounts than you would find in food is of any benefit. But in general, it's not true. There may be some very specialised cases, and I can think of them, but for the general part, what we're wanting people to do is to get enough protein, high quality protein, and eat it as food and spread it over the day. And when you do it that way, the food's providing you not just with amino acids, but you're going to get other nutritional value. And when you do it that way, you sort of balance a whole range of needs at the same time. When you're taking an amino acid by itself, you're paying a lot more money for that amino acid, but you're taking it away from the calcium or the iron that was in the dairy or the meat that you would have had otherwise. So in 99% of the cases, what we would suggest people do is look to protein sources, particularly food, and there may be some times when a supplemental form is useful, just because, between meals or when you're in the middle of nowhere and you're wanting to have your protein recovery, it might be easier to have the flavoured milk or the packaged version of it than doing something that you have to cook and prepare yourself.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Andrea, for raising that point. And now John brings in another supplement-related question, this time focusing on youth athletes. And he's asking, do you advise creatine and protein shakes to be combined for athletes under 18?
Most of the time when you're working with athletes under 18, they're developing. And most of the benefit they're going to see to their performance is coming from doing the training, supporting the training with everyday foods, and just growing older and getting bigger. And when athletes get to the level of elite where they've sort of maximised those processes, that's when it can be useful to think about supplements. And certainly creatine is a supplement that's evidence-based and may be useful when you get to the point where you've reached the end of what you can get from just starting the training process and getting to the area of growing. I've been lucky enough to work with some exceptional athletes, people who are world champions at 15 and 16, and they're very unusual people. And perhaps in those situations, you could say, well, they've reached that point earlier in their lifespan than they've been training since they were 4, and they've now reached the level that most other people reach when they're 25. So they're unusual. But most situations, you say to youth athletes that there's much better benefits from the everyday food and getting the training right. And then it's good to have something to look forward to when you reach that level where you've sort of topped out, and then you can start saying, right, what's next? And if you can save your resources, there's a lot. I mean, I would say that a visit to a dietitian would cost the same amount of money as a jar of protein powder, and you'd get much better value from getting a sort of a nutrition plan and a bigger picture perspective than just taking some extra protein when you can find other ways of getting that. So I'm more about making sure the basics are looked after and then gradually adding to that, rather than thinking, let's just go straight for all the sparkly stuff.
Thanks, Louise. Let's go to the next question. Agata, who trains in sports shooting, she's asking something quite sports specific, and she says, how should I adjust my nutrition plan to make the most out of it? Do I still need the same carb loading, or if I have to then calculate my needs differently? What do you think about this question, Liz?
I would say I haven't worked with a lot of shooters, and so my insight into what shooters need to do is not great. But working with somebody that does understand what it takes to be a shooter, the kind of training that you do, whether it's the conditioning work, spending time in the gym, doing aerobic work to build the physiology that makes you able to do the shooting, but then practicing the skill part of it. It maybe takes long hours, and you need to be out in the elements, and you may have long periods of time where you need to be concentrating. That requires nutrition support that's both fuel and fluid, etc. But it's something I think that's very specific to your training program and the kind of event that you're doing. So again, I would be saying going to see somebody who understands shooting and talking to them about, this is your specific training program. When you're doing this sort of training, this is some of the feelings that you have, or this is some of the monitoring that you're doing, showing you this and that. And once someone can understand the perspective of what you're doing, then they can tailor a plan that says, right, these are the important things that nutrition can do for you, and this is how we can organise it in your day so that it makes the best out of your training program. And it's so specific to you, even though we might say this is a sport that's unique, it's still going to be even more unique to you and the way that you practice it. So I think working with somebody that can hear about you means that you will get the better program.
Thanks, Louise. And this then brings us to the next question. It's actually about the weight bearing sports. And actually, Louise is also a very common question. And her question is, can you speak a little about weight bearing sports and nutritional intake? In climbing, weight, of course, plays a crucial role in performance, but also nutrition. What strategies could help optimize performance and reduce the risk of RDS?
Yes. So this is where people need to learn about what works for them as an individual and where their weight is healthy and easily maintained. So it's all about a balance between expenditure through mostly exercise and intake through mostly food, and finding ways in which you think, what's my natural physique and what can I do to modify that still keeps it real, that it's not stressing myself or trying to be too different to what my natural body target is. It's very easy to say, oh, yes, if I was lighter, then I could climb faster because I'm pulling less body mass with me. But often when people actually do that, in the first instance, they might feel, oh, this was great. I've much lighter now and I'm doing things better. But then they start getting injured and then they start getting tired, and that's because they're not getting the nutritional support from the other angle of what's important for sport. And so if we can get people to understand that they've got a background as an individual that has some things that are natural for them, and you can manipulate it a little bit, but you can't suddenly, if you're an athlete that's this tall and this heavy, you can't suddenly chop 6 inches off your height, and 10 kilos off your weight and this still be you. So it's understanding you're trying to optimize and perfect you. And in many sports, people often find that even though they might be different to another climber, that gives them their own personal advantages. And it means that the style with which they climb or the way that they train can be manipulated to get the best out of themselves, rather than saying everybody who's a climber has to look like this and weigh this, and that's the only way to be the best. Often when you get to the Olympic Games and you're watching an event, you'll look at the field and you'll say, wow, there are so many different sizes and shaped people in that event. And so it's obviously possible to be very good in different ways. And so rather than all trying to be the same, if we can think of ourselves as having a starting point, then we can try and perfect us by doing what's good for us and making the most of our abilities and our unique physiology, rather than sort of trying to stress ourselves to turn into something else.
Thanks, Louise. Next question. Michelle notes something many of us hear regularly, and she's asking, I'm constantly being asked to advise on creatine and the different peptides. What would your advice be about this?
About creatine? Well, look,
correct.
Creatine is a supplemental form of a nutrient that we produce in our own bodies, but we don't produce as much as can be stored in our muscle. And when you creatine supplement, you can increase the amount of creatine, and particularly a compound called phosphocreatine, in the muscle, and that's an energy store. And it's used to create a quick form of energy, particularly when you're doing very high intensity work. And so sports in which repetition of high intensity work, either in the event itself or in the training phase, often benefit from creatine loading. But that has to be balanced against some other things about creatine. And that includes the cost. It includes the fact that, as you said before, Amanda, that some of the supplements are a risk of an anti-doping outcome. And so finding a safe and batch-tested supply is important. But also in some sports, the weight aspect is critical. And so one of the things that happens with creatine is that it causes a small weight gain. And it may help the athlete to gain more muscle mass because it's amplifying the results of their resistance training. And in some cases, that's not helpful to the sport, because in that sport, it might be that being lighter or being more agile is important. So we can't just assume that because creatine is evidence-based to do a certain thing, that it's going to be right for every athlete. And it mightn't be right for every phase of the athlete's preparation or every phase of the year. So that's where you need to work with your sports team, with hopefully sports science support, to sit down and work out, is this going to be something that can be beneficial for whether it's competition itself or whether it's the training for competition? And then what would be the best way of using it if you are a candidate to get benefits? And then finding that safe supply that you can feel is at a very low risk of causing the doping outcome. So even though it's an example of one of the evidence-based supplements, we put it in the A group in the AIS supplement program, that doesn't mean that every athlete should be using it, or that there should be the creatine cupboard in the gym, and that when you walk in, everyone says, "Oh, just go and help yourself." It's a very specialized product that needs to be undertaken and in the right way with expert advice to see that it's right for the individual, and that you're monitoring the results to see that it actually is giving you what you think.
Thanks, Louise. I believe we have time for one more question. And the last question is, next up, As a 29-year-old corporate professional who started sports late, my workload often disrupts training. How can I use nutrition to maintain fitness, recovery, and energy despite an irregular training agenda?
It's hard to cut corners. Like to get the best out of your sport, you actually have to do the training. There's no food that's going to replace the fact that you missed a training session. And I know when you're busy, time's really valuable. So I'd be thinking a bit more of what can I do to be organised so that I can commit to my training, but maybe that I can save some time in other areas of my life. Maybe I can be more organised with the way that I'm preparing meals so that I do all my cooking on Sundays, for example, then I've made all my meals for the week. And so when I am thinking about my busy week, I can still get the training in, knowing that when I come home, I just have to zap something in the microwave rather than start from scratch to cook it. And then I've made more efficient use of my time to be able to get both the training and the nutritional support.
Thanks, Louise. I believe we're running out of time. So before we wrap up, I just want to thank all of you, our attendees, for being with us today. Your time, your attention, and about your commitment to clean sport is what really makes these sessions meaningful. And of course, a special thanks to Louise for joining us. Now, if we didn't get to your question today, or if you have further questions later, please do not hesitate to send us an email to education@ita.sport. That's our wrap for today. On behalf of the ITA Education team, thank you once again. We look forward to seeing you in one of our next sessions very soon. And until then, good luck, stay strong, and thank you for joining us today. It's a good afternoon from us in Switzerland, and have a great rest of your day.